a good morning, good day, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on from where you're joining us. My name is Lisbeth Kazir. I lead ISD's work on sustainable public procurement and also work with our infrastructure team to make the case for more investment in sustainable transport infrastructure. That's a big part of our work. And I'll be moderating today's session. I'm also joined by many of my colleagues. We have my colleague Michael, Andrea, Becca, and Ronja, who are here with us today to present some of the work we've been doing and undertaking in the sustainable transport and mobility infrastructure sector. We'll be starting shortly. People will be joining us in the next few minutes. In the meantime, just mentioned, we would like to encourage you to use the chat function in Zoom for any questions or issues you may have during the webinar. We'll make sure there's some moments where you can also unmute yourself and ask some questions you may have on the presentations that we'll be following today. And we'll also be recording this session so we can share this with you afterwards. At ISD, over the past few years, we've been working on making the case for investments in sustainable transport and mobility infrastructure. And we've been looking at infrastructure investments in cities in Albania, India, Indonesia, Colombia, as well as Senegal. So from all around the world, what we'll be doing in this webinar series, the three-part webinar series, is to present some of this work, but also use this as an exchange with you over the next 2 weeks to learn more about your work on sustainable mobility and sustainable transport as well. As you'll hear more today, and I think many of you are familiar with this, we know there's massive needs for investments in sustainable mobility infrastructure. We have growing populations, especially in cities that are at the same time under pressure due to climate change, environmental issues such as air pollution, health-related impacts, which really leads us to questioning how we can invest in better and more sustainable transport systems. And the work of our team has focused on providing economic analysis, integrated cost-benefit analysis on specific sustainable infrastructure projects, and in this case, transport specifically, to shed some light and provide some evidence that when we integrate sustainability throughout the infrastructure lifecycle, be it in the design of projects, the material use, the way projects are being operated, what we're seeing is that those are actually investments with a return that's many times higher than the unsustainable transport infrastructure options. And so we've been undertaking a series of those economic assessments to value sustainable transport infrastructure and to showcase that that's really providing value for money, not only for governments or for investors, but also for citizens. And to do so, ISD over the years started working with a methodology called the Sustainable Asset Valuation Methodology, or SAVi, which is rooted in systems thinking, which is really one of the aspects which we think is necessary to understand the wider impacts of infrastructure development. And today marks the first of 3 webinars, each in which we will explain more about this methodology to quantify economic, environmental, and social return of projects. And in each of those, we'll also be presenting a case study that we worked on and that we analyzed over the past year. This webinar series is really meant to support raising awareness on sustainable transport infrastructure, and also to introduce you to methods that can help stakeholders identify and quantify the sustainability impacts of infrastructure investments. And then lastly, we of course also want to stimulate a discussion on how we can best tackle some of the questions around investment in sustainable transport and mobility. Generally, we'd like to make these sessions as interactive as possible, depending on the number of participants we have, but I think that should be feasible today. We'd be really happy to hear from you, questions you may have, comments, remarks. but also to understand better the areas of work around this team that you're working in, and some of the challenges and barriers that you see in the area of investing in sustainable transport infrastructure. So we'll have dedicated Q&A moments during which we'll pick up your questions and unmute and give you the floor, so that we can really also meet that objective, not only to learn and just you hearing from us, so that we can also hear from you. Now, in order for us to actually know who's with us today and who's here in the room, we have a very short poll for you on a tool called Mentimeter. I think the housekeeping rules, we've done them. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So we have a Mentimeter poll that we just like you to answer for a moment, so we know more about who's here and who you are, in what sector you work, but also to hear a little bit more about what brought you here and what you would like to know more about, and what are you seeing as the main challenges in this area of sustainable transport infrastructure. So I will ask my colleagues, if they haven't yet already done so, to put the link to this Mentimeter in the chat, so it will follow soon. Here you go. Or you can scan the QR code, and then you should be able to see these first few questions of the poll. So please let us know whether you can access it, whether it works, and let us know who you are and what you're interested in learning more about. And while we ask participants to fill in the survey or the poll, I'll just take a minute to also introduce the colleagues who you'll be hearing more from today. So we have with us Michael Kapitanakis and my colleague Andrea Bassi. Both have been working with ISD for a long time on sustainable infrastructure and sustainable transport, as well as nature-based infrastructure. And you'll be hearing more about their work today. And also want to thank my colleagues Becca and Ronja for being here for the support in relation to this work. So I'll just wait a few more moments till we get some more responses on the questions we've been asking. And I can probably very briefly share my screen. So Michael, don't worry, I'll be taking over for just a few minutes to show participants the responses to the questions, and then you can take it over again. So this is always a great start for us to hear more about what you would like to know more about. We'll definitely dive into the systems thinking approach. Integrated cost benefit is something we're working on a daily basis, so you'll hear much more about that. It's interesting that someone's interested also in the link between nature-based infrastructure and sustainable transport systems. I think that's something we can pick up in the questions and in our moment for discussion later. And certainly how to value sustainability methods for valuing externalities is something that we aim to address through the 3 webinars throughout, and through the case studies. You'll be hearing more from colleagues on how that was done. I'm also curious to hear more about the challenges that you've been seeing in this area around sustainable transport and mobility investments. Certainly finance is something that's mentioned a few times. And interestingly, also this reliance on private cars and a lack of understanding about the systemic benefits of sustainable transport, which is certainly the case for what we've seen in our work as well. in terms of the role that public transport and mass transit can play in this area. The notion of sustainable transport being poorly understood by policymakers and planners is something that I think many of you here, and certainly something that we try to do at ISD as well, something we try to work on. And then the demand for infrastructure exceeding available funding, also the challenges around how do we actually deploy enough funding and financing into investments in sustainable infrastructure. So thanks a lot for the responses to these questions. I think Michael, you can take over and reshare the screen. Perhaps I'll just introduce participants to today's agenda. There we go. Thank you. So today you'll be hearing more, I would say, a classic, the what and why of sustainable transport. Why are we here, and why are we talking about this topic? You'll be hearing more about what's the sustainable asset valuation methodology, and you'll hear from a case study of non-motorized transport in Coimbatore in India, a case study in which we are showcasing what's the importance of valuing economic, social, and environmental impacts in that specific project. So without further ado, you'll see on the next slide how the session will be structured, and we'll make sure we have a Q&A after the explanation about the SAVi methodology, as well as after the case study. But I really would like to encourage all of you. We're not necessarily a large group, so there will be a lot of time for questions. Do write them in the chat already, and otherwise feel free to raise your hands during the Q&A session as well. So we can give you the floor and have an open discussion around how we best value the sustainability impacts of sustainable transport infrastructure. So with that, Michael, over to you, and looking forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisbeth, and hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining. So, as Lisbeth mentioned, this session will start with sustainable transport more generally, and then we'll talk about the sustainable asset valuation methodology, or SAVi, as we call it at the International Institute of Sustainable Development. And the third section of today will present a case study in Coimbatore, in a city in southern India, a non-motorized transport project case study. So let's start with firstly defining sustainable transport, and you will see how this definition is based on some key economic, social, and environmental outcomes or goals. So sustainable transport here is defined as the provision of services and infrastructure for the mobility of people and goods, advancing economic and social development to benefit today's and future generations in a manner that is safe, affordable, accessible, efficient, and resilient, while also minimizing carbon and other emissions and environmental impacts. This is the textbook definition. Now, let's take some of the impacts that were included in the definition of sustainable transport one by one, and show some key transport statistics. So in terms of safety, more than 1.25 million people are killed, or up to 50 million are injured on the world's roads every year. In terms of health, around 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men do not do enough physical activity to stay healthy. You will see how this is related to our work and SAVi later in the session. In terms of affordability, poor households in the US spend about 27% of their income on transportation. This is much higher in many other parts of the world. And in terms of accessibility, only half the world's urban population has convenient access to public transportation. So let's continue with some key statistics in terms of resilience, and more generally, climate impacts greatly affect cities and their transportation systems through extreme temperature and weather events, as well as natural disasters that significantly damage infrastructure and endanger lives. In terms of efficiency, public transport is much more energy efficient than private vehicles. Cars require almost 2.2 times more energy per passenger kilometer than buses, and 7 times more than rail transport. And in terms of emissions, air and noise pollution, transport accounts for 37% of CO2 emissions from end-use sectors. More than 4 million people die annually from outdoor air pollution, and 100 million people in the EU alone are affected by road traffic noise. Now, let's talk about how sustainable transport is directly related to some of the sustainable development goals. So firstly, sustainable cities. By 2030, they provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all. And special attention should be given to the needs of those in vulnerable situations, such as women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. Sustainable transport is also related to good health, as many traffic accidents and deaths are related to transport and to traffic accidents. It's also related to affordable and clean energy. Obviously, it's related to infrastructure in order to support economic development and human well-being, with a focus of affordable and equitable access for all. And it is also related to responsible consumption and production. This is in relation to both polluting fossil fuels and sustainable public procurement practices. Here are the key strategies for sustainable transport and the ones we usually adopt when we apply the SAVi methodology to our transport assessments. So firstly, we have avoid, which is an approach to avoid unnecessary motorized travel. Examples include non-motorized transport, such as walking and cycling. This is directly related to the case study I will talk to you about later in the case study from India. Second approach is shift, which is basically shifting from polluting to more sustainable transport modes, such as from cars to public transport, such as metros and railways. And the third part is about improving the overall performance of the transport system through policies or technologies that also encourage energy efficiency and energy from renewable sources. So these three approaches should also be complemented by the improvement of energy efficiency and the use of clean renewable energy where possible. This is a very important point because electrifying transport is a step in the right direction, but decarbonizing the electricity supply is paramount for the transition to renewable energy. So we need both. And this slide shows that good practices include supporting non-motorized transport, such as cycling and walking, making public transport more attractive and efficient, integrating intelligent interconnection of transport systems, for example, such as car sharing and intermodal transports, and of course, reducing car traffic as much as possible. Now, let's move to the sustainable asset valuation methodology that we use for our sustainable transport projects and policies at the International Institute of Sustainable Development, in order to understand a little bit more about that methodology and how we use it to assess these projects and policies. So let's talk about how and why it was developed in the first place, the SAVi methodology. It was developed in response to traditional infrastructure assessments that consider only financial indicators. and do not integrate economic, social, and environmental parameters in decision making, especially those parameters that go beyond the immediate scope of the project. So, in a few words, SAVi assesses the project in an integrated and systemic way, and looks at infrastructure firstly from a financial perspective, but also from a society perspective. And in order to do that, it values tangible and intangible parameters. Simply put, it helps governments and investors steer capital towards sustainable infrastructure and demonstrates how this can deliver better value for money for all, being governments and cities, investors, and of course, citizens. So SAVi has three main features. First one is simulation. It combines different modeling approaches to show the financial performance of projects under different scenarios. These scenarios can be, for example, what are the climate change impacts on road maintenance of a certain project? What is the employment created of another project? And these modeling approaches can include systems thinking, system dynamics, spatial modeling, and project finance modeling. Systems thinking and system dynamics, I will talk about later, and especially in the next session. So yeah, I'll definitely elaborate on these approaches. The second feature is valuation. So we try to place a financial value on a variety of economic, social, and environmental externalities and risks. For example, environmental could be on air pollution or CO2 emissions of a certain project, and socioeconomic could include employment creation, GDP contributions, and so on. And very importantly, the third feature is about customization. So we try to customize our assessment as much as possible to reflect local conditions and needs in different contexts. So in order to do that, we use local data where possible. For example, data on traffic, data on pollution, data on CO2 emissions, in order to reflect local conditions. This whole process is co-created through a multi-stakeholder approach. That this whole approach helps us kind of identify these risks and opportunities that are unique to the project. Now, a little bit more on the valuation part of different sustainable transport projects. We try to identify and value in financial terms the different types of impacts or externalities, as we call them. This can be divided into economic, social, and environmental categories. So economic could be about the contribution to economic development, land and real estate prices, revenues in affected sectors such as retail. Social could be related to jobs, employment creation, employment loss, and impacts on human health, any health costs. And then environmental include water and air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity impacts that transport projects can have, and so on. Now, the steps of the SAVi methodology, I'm not going to go too much into detail on this slide, but this is basically how we approach a project and how we engage with a client for a specific assessment. So first, we try to understand the infrastructure asset or strategy, what the plan is. We try to engage and learn and collect as much data as possible. Local data, again, if possible, so the results are more accurate. If not, we use other studies or proxies or use secondary research. Then we map the key externalities and risks. And then we create the model and we confirm the scenarios. And then in the next steps, we develop the simulation. We discuss preliminary results with a client that can be a local, regional, or national government. And then once we do confirm scenarios and the results, and we change the numbers. At the end, we are ready to publish the report and present the results. So in some of our assessments, we also use EU Copernicus data for specific climate change impacts. These include a wide range of climate change, atmospheric and land monitoring data, in order to help us forecast different climate change scenarios. So as we know, climate change will have a huge impact on infrastructure, use and efficiency. So we try to take this into account in our assessments. Now, let's look at an overview of the SAVi model. Basically, you can see in this slide the quantitative and qualitative analysis that we undertake in SAVi assessments. So first part is the qualitative part, and includes the systems mapping and the causal loop diagram that I will show more in the next session in more detail. And it basically is mapping and identifying and mapping all the different impacts of a transport project or policy across environmental, social, and economic parameters, as you can see in the top right corner. So the quantitative part of the analysis comes after that, and includes many different modeling approaches, like location-specific data, spatially explicit analysis, climate data and forecasts, and literature review. Again, all of these touch upon a wide range of social, environmental, and economic data and indicators. And the final models are a system dynamics model, which is developed using a software called Vensim, or an Excel-based model, or both at times. And of course, the final product is the integrated cost-benefit analysis. Oops, sorry. So SAVi has been applied so far to a variety of different infrastructure sectors and assets. It started with energy project and has expanded to transport, buildings, water and irrigation, and nature-based infrastructure. So little parentheses about nature-based infrastructure. It is something that we work on a lot at IISD. It's linked to all other sectors and looks at opportunities where natural solutions rather than grey infrastructure can provide infrastructure services needed. One example could include using mangroves rather than building a dam against flooding effects. As you can see on the map on the right in this slide, SAVi has been applied to many different projects across the globe. And the projects that are specifically related to sustainable transport are on the next slide. This is what we have been working on recently. As you can see, in many different countries and across many different transport sectors. We look at infrastructure assets such as the non-motorized transport in India that I will present later in the session. We looked at bus rapid transit systems in Indonesia and Senegal. We also looked at a metro, the mass rapid transit in Colombia. It's the first elevated metro in the city. And we also assess policy or strategy level transport plans, if you will. So, for example, in India, we look at an electric vehicles policy called FAME. In Colombia, in Bogota, we also looked at the sustainable transport strategy of the city, and so on. So many different projects, many different countries being analyzed. And here, before we move on to the case study in India, let's take a few minutes to answer any questions you may have until now. I hope it wasn't too much information for those of you who are not familiar with our work. So please feel free to ask any questions or insert them in the chat, or please ask out loud, of course.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this first part of the presentation. I hope indeed that everyone has been able to digest the volume of information that was just provided, and so just want to take a few minutes to give people a chance to raise their hands or even directly unmute. I think is certainly most welcome. Perhaps while we wait for any questions, what I wanted to do is briefly pick up on one of the points that was made through the Mentimeter earlier around understanding linkages between sustainable transport and nature-based infrastructure. So I don't know, Michael, if you have any thoughts on that, given that you looked a lot at transport investments in cities, and we know that cities also have to deal with those challenges of climate change, to which nature-based infrastructure often provides an answer. And just wondering if you have any thoughts on how the two may or may not interact together.
Thank you for this question. So this is an area that we are currently trying to explore. We have been working in a lot of transport projects and also on a lot of nature-based infrastructure projects. And we would like to combine those in an urban context in order to kind of increase the long-term benefits that both can have in the long term. So we have been looking at, let's say, transport projects that could have infrastructure that is also related to nature, such as green roofs, or urban farms, or even just trees that can provide shade and cooling effects, and use old transport infrastructure in urban context as well, to aggregate these benefits. So this is definitely an area that we have been exploring recently.
Thank you. I don't know if there were other thoughts from other colleagues on this as well. And also looking at the audience here, if you have any other questions, please drop them in the chat or unmute yourself.
Lisbeth, I can offer some additional thoughts on the connection between nature and transport. And in addition to what Michael mentioned, meaning that nature-based infrastructure or nature-based solutions can increase the interest of people in using, say, public transport, in using non-motorized transport options like walking and cycling, because the environment is more pleasant, right? And we have trees, we have biodiversity, we have the effect of shading, reduced temperature, and so on and so forth. But we also have the other element of improved climate resilience of the transport infrastructure because of the water retention that trees and biomass would offer, the percolation of water, so reducing the speed and the amount of water that we have during high rainfall events. And so overall, we see that synergetic, say, impact with the climate resilience that would support all sorts of transport infrastructure, as well as buildings and other type of infrastructure and assets we have at the urban level and also the rural level. And then the extra advantage of driving demand higher because of the environment possibly being a bit more pleasant.
Thank you, Andrea. I think, Michael, you can continue with the presentation and on the case study, and we'll pick up any questions there after as well.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll move to the case study of the non-motorized transport network in Coimbatore in South India. So the following slides will look at the overview of the project. We will also look at the system dynamics model, the causal loop diagram. Again, I will elaborate on these concepts in the next session. We'll look at key indicators and results of the project, and let's say the main lessons learned at the end. And then feel free to have questions about the case study specifically as well. So the Indian city of Coimbatore as many different cities in India and beyond face numerous urban mobility and development challenges, such as high traffic volumes and congestion, air pollution, and economic inefficiencies. And these are, of course, projected to worsen with climate change and continued urban development. So to address these challenges, the city of Coimbatore proposed a comprehensive network of non-motorized transport routes across the city. So this is pedestrian and cycling routes implemented over a period of 15 years. So the main objective of this NMT network was overall to reduce congestion, to reduce commuting times, to improve air quality by reducing emissions, to encourage active travel in general in the city, because it can also lead and contribute to healthy lifestyles, of course. And we, as ISD, we were basically from our side, we're able to assess the economic viability of that plan that was developed by the local government, considering the social, economic, and environmental indicators that I will show you a bit later in this slide deck, in order to assess the value for money for public support. So a little bit more detail on this specific case study. We tried to assess the impact of non-motorized transport on a neighborhood sustainability, socioeconomic development. Some of the impacts that we tried to take into account was human well-being and health. Any impact, for example, that the project would have on local businesses, and so on. So I'll show these impacts in more detail. So here we have the overall objectives of the SAVi assessment. Again, is to assess the environmental, social, and economic impacts that a non-motorized transport network can have in a city like Coimbatore, to quantify the added benefits and avoided costs, as well as the direct costs of the non-motorized transport network, and evaluate the economic and financial performance of the network. Now here are the added benefits, avoided costs, and investment costs that we modeled for this particular project. Basically, let's start with the investment costs, which are included in traditional infrastructure assessments as well. So we have the capital cost of a project and the operation maintenance costs. But what we added in this case is a number of added benefits and avoided costs that are usually not valued in such assessments. Added benefits include income creation from employment, any health impacts that the NMT can have on the city, what's the value of time saved for commuting, for people that are avoiding traffic by not being in a car and using a bicycle, for example. What are the impacts on property prices and retail revenues across the city? And we also looked at some avoided costs, such as CO2 emissions, avoided costs of fuel use, avoided cost of traffic accidents, noise pollution, and road maintenance, as well as non-motorized transport has much lower maintenance costs. So here you can see a causal loop diagram, which is a system dynamics model or map. Again, I will talk in much more detail about the technical part of our work and the causal loop diagram and the system dynamics in the next session. But basically, it is think of it as a mental map that helps us identify the different economic, social, environmental impacts of a certain project. In this case, the indicators that I mentioned in the previous slide, all the added benefits and avoided costs, basically. And basically, we take these impacts and we try to find synergies, we try to find relations and connections between them. And this is one of the key advantages of SAVi, is that it allows us to look at a system as a complex and integrated entity. So we look at how these kind of key performance indicators and outcomes interact with each other. And we do not assess them in isolation, but in combination. We understand that these are different in every context. And again, we try to find synergies between them. So just to provide a few quick examples, let's look at 3 relationships or loops, as we call it, from this causal loop diagram as an example. So in the first loop, we look at investment in NMT infrastructure, in this case by the municipal government of Coimbatore. So investment in NMT infrastructure in this case leads to more people using NMT in the city, which in time drives retail revenues and property prices up. So retail revenues, because more people stop at the retail establishments when walking or cycling, and property prices because properties gain value as they benefit from, for example, reduced air or noise pollution in a neighborhood where non-motorized transport rather than cars is the main mode of transport. So it basically revitalizes the local economy and provides a better environment which drives up property value. Overall, this leads to higher GDP in the long term, which in turn leads to higher investment in NMT infrastructure. And this whole loop is a positive feedback loop. So we call this a feedback loop because changes are exponential, as opposed to a balancing loop where basically the relationship reaches an equilibrium. More on this in the next session. Similarly, the second loop that you can see that includes more social impacts. Investment in NMT infrastructure leads to more people using NMT, which in turn reduces traffic accidents as more people shift from using cars and motorcycles to bikes or to walking. Reduce traffic accidents and any associated medical costs that are usually borne by the government leads to higher GDP and productivity, which in turn increases investments in NMT infrastructure again. So that's another positive feedback loop. And lastly, looking at environmental impacts mostly, again, we start from the same point. Investing in NMT infrastructure leads to more NMT use, which leads to reduced motorized vehicles on the road. So reduced fuel use, which means that there's lower CO2 emissions and air pollution across the city, which also increases productivity and GDP in the long term. And hence, there's more investment to NMT infrastructure. So this is how we calculate some of these added benefits and avoided costs. I'm not going to go too much into detail about how we calculate all these different impacts because it depends on the data that we have. But please, if you have any questions about a specific impact or on how it can be calculated, please let us know after, and we can discuss. I will present 1 or 2 examples, but I'm not going to go too much into detail. The key here is that it's very important to have access to data that accurately reflect the local conditions of a project. So the more local data we have, for example, data for employment, air pollution, CO2 emissions, data on accidents, the more accurate the results will be for a specific infrastructure project. So in this case, we were lucky. We received quite a lot of data from Coimbatore, specific to the city, but we also very often, if we don't have access to local data, we have to use proxies or data from other studies, cities, or countries often. But in this case, just to give you an example, so when we had to calculate the increase in property prices, we looked at the total area impacted by the non-motorized transport. So this data was provided to us by the government the municipal government in Coimbatore. We also looked at the property value per square meter. This can be found online, for example, for Coimbatore specifically. And we also looked at secondary literature review of looking at which multiplier we need to use of how property increases as a result of a non-motorized transport project. So would it be a 5% increase? Would it be a 10% increase? We can also include different sensitivity analysis to calculate different impacts if we're not sure about this percentage and so on. And one more example, for example, how we calculated the avoided cost of traffic accidents. So what we did is we looked at the accident numbers in the city across different categories. So they can be major injury, minor injury, or a fatality. All of these have different costs. So we calculated by multiplying basically based on the shift from cars to NMT modes. There's going to be less car use, so less accidents. So we try to calculate that based on the cost per accident, per severity, the number of accidents, and the shift from motorized to non-motorized transport. Again, if you have any questions about this, I know this may seem complicated at this point, please ask towards the end and we can discuss any of these impacts, how we calculate it, how we approach it, and so on. Really quickly, I will go over the scenarios that we modeled in this particular case study. So we had a business as usual scenario, BAU, and the non-motorized transport scenario. We can see that based on local data that was provided to us, we looked at a 4% reduction in the share of private motor vehicles, a 3% increase in the share of walking, and a 2% increase in the share of cycling. So that was the objective. We tried to model what would happen if there are these increases and reductions and shifts in the city over the next 15 years. So we've been through the different indicators and the scenarios. So let's move to the general results and what we found from this assessment. So these are the results. I will also show them graphically, which is it's going to be clearer. But basically, to start with, this is an integrated cost-benefit analysis of the project. We consider a project period of 23 years. So these values are cumulative over these 23 years, from 2022 to 2045. And the construction period lasts 15 years. So from 2022 to 2037. And all of these values are discounted. So they are discounted based on Green Book guidance. This is a guidance, if you're not familiar, that it's a guidance for assessing infrastructure projects more generally. So these are the final numbers, but let's look at them in more detail and also graphically to make some conclusions about the results that we had. So here, really quickly at the end, we have the net benefit of the cost-benefit analysis. In general, it indicates whether an intervention generates a net positive or net negative impact at system level. In this case, it generates a net positive result. And each number that you see in this case corresponds to an economic, social, or environmental change in the system. In this case, in Coimbatore. As you saw in the previous slide, we have a low estimate and a high estimate. This is where, when we are unsure about the magnitude of an impact or different sources of data that indicate different values for an impact, we include a sensitivity analysis. So we include different values for different impacts. In this case, we did that for 3 different impacts shown with an asterisk. So health impacts, increase in property values, and cost of road maintenance. We include different values, as you can see, to account for potential differences in these factors. But let's look at the most conservative scenario, the low estimate. We find that the avoided cost of traffic accidents resulting from the shift from motorized transport to non-motorized transport show the largest value. You can see it here. So this is the largest, let's say, impact across added benefits and avoided costs. And this is followed by health benefits. And health benefits in this case include avoided cost of air pollution and added benefits from increased physical activity, in this case for cycling or walking more. And at the end, we also looked at the benefit cost ratio, the net benefit per dollar invested, which indicates basically how much value is created for each dollar investment. Now, we'll talk about this later as well, but we have differentiated between two benefit cost ratios. So one, we calculate using only tangible parameters, such as investment and cost, and avoided cost of fuel use, avoided cost of road maintenance, and then the sustainable benefit cost ratio includes all of the social, environmental, and economic added benefits and avoided costs. And you can see that there is a difference here, quite a big difference. But we will elaborate on this on a later slide. So let's look at the results now a little bit more graphically to make sense of them. So here we can see the results that shows all added benefits and avoided costs of the non-motorized transport project in Coimbatore. And here you can see that the largest benefit by far is the avoided cost of accidents. So much less accidents, which will bring us a lot of value as a result of the NMT network. Again, followed by the health benefits, which include benefits from increased physical activity and avoided cost of air pollution. And the third largest impact in this case is the avoided cost of fuel use from the reduction of cars, from the reduction of car use, more people using non-motorized transport. This graph also looks at capital investment in orange, as you can see here, which not surprisingly also has a large value, but not large enough if we compare it to the multiple benefits of the project. Here we see the very same impacts, but in two time periods. So we see how they develop over time. So in the first part of this graph, it's from the beginning of the project period until 2034. And then the second part is from the beginning to the end of the project period, 2045. So as we can see, the values across different impacts, especially the social and environmental ones, increase over time. So what is the key lesson from this? Is that most indirect economic, social, and environmental benefits of such sustainable infrastructure projects take a very long time to materialize and become more valuable over time compared to benefits of, let's say, conventional infrastructure projects that very often decrease over time. So it's really, really important to have a long-term horizon when assessing these kind of projects that have all these environmental social benefits long-term. And here, again, the results overall, as you can see on the graph on the left, the investment costs are only the tip of the iceberg. They're quite small compared to the total benefits across economic, social, environmental impacts of this project. And on the right, we're looking at standalone impacts, as mentioned before, showing the highest positive impact of this project, again related to avoid the cost of accidents, followed by the health added benefits from health as a result of the non-motorized transport network, avoid cost of fuel. Retail revenues are also significant. We have time saved, values related to time saved as well. Avoid the cost of road maintenance as well. So many different impacts that are usually not included in such sustainable transport assessments. And here to elaborate on the different benefit cost ratios that we usually calculate. So again, what we try to do is to compare a, let's say, conventional benefit cost ratio that only looks at tangible parameters. So we only take the investment and maintenance costs. In this case, the avoided cost of fuel use and avoided cost of road maintenance. So there's no social environmental impacts, and the sustainable benefit cost ratio that includes all different social environmental added benefits and avoided costs. And as you can see, across both low and high estimates, we can see that the sustainable benefit cost ratio is much, much higher than the conventional benefit cost ratio. Is around 10 times higher, which basically shows how important it is to consider and value intangible and indirect impacts when assessing an infrastructure project, in this case, a transport project. And finally, overall, what we found is that this assessment that we undertook provides evidence of the firstly of the economic viability of the non-motorized transport network in Coimbatore. It does significantly increase the environmental, social, and economic added benefits and avoided costs. And it makes the case for NMT and other NMT, let's say, networks and other forms of sustainable mobility solutions. So using the SAVi methodology and looking at all these different impacts makes a stronger case for sustainable solution as such. We found that overall the NMT network does meet its goals of providing a more efficient, convenient, safe, and affordable transport network. It has a lot of positive health effects related to increased physical activity and reduced air pollution. It has economic benefits related to increased property and retail prices, and it also overall reduces CO2 emissions. So it meets its objectives. And at this point, we move to any questions you may have. I know this is a lot of information that I have provided, very specific to one project. So please, any question you have about the case study or about our methodology or anything that you want to discuss, please feel free to ask or include in the chat. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the in-depth presentation about that NMT project and really showcasing how quantifying those avoided costs and added benefits really help to make the case for investment in NMT networks, specifically in Coimbatore, but also in other cities. Certainly, there's lessons to learn from understanding the real value of NMT projects. I would perhaps ask you, Michael, to stop screen sharing so we actually get a bit of a better sense of who's in the room, and I would even stop, I think, putting the spotlight on us, but I will put the spotlight on the participants and who's here. I'm actually just going to remove that. There we go. I would encourage, though some people do still find it awkward, despite the fact we've been on Zoom for many years now, but feel free to switch on your cameras. There's no reason why we can't have this exchange and see who's actually is actually here, which is always nice. So if your connection allows, feel free to switch on cameras. There's a broad question that came into the Q&A, and a more targeted question, which is very much related to the NMT presentation just now. So I would like to pick up the question of John first, and then we'll go to Magona's question, and then perhaps Magona, you wanna provide some context to that as well. But so the question of John is on the avoided cost of road accidents, which seems to be very high. I think certainly the pie graph demonstrates that. And in congested cities, would traffic not be traveling slowly, therefore make accidents less likely and or less costly? So perhaps you can shed some light, Michael, on the calculation of that avoided cost of road accidents and where that high number, let's say, comes from.
Yes, of course, and it's a good question, and thank you, John. So I would start with the fact that it depends what we consider as avoided cost of accidents on how big the value is. So there are the kind of direct impacts. For example, if there are some traffic accidents, any medical costs that are related to that. But then we can also look at the wider impacts. For example, what would be the kind of productivity benefits of a person over its lifetime that will be lost because of a traffic accident. So depending on how we calculate these value can be from small to really big. Now, on the second part of your question of if traffic would be, traveling slowly in the cities, I think this is true in some areas, especially in central areas of such cities. But don't forget that these cities are also overpopulated. There's many different transport modes. Infrastructure, for example, pedestrian infrastructure is always not the best in these cities. So these traffic accidents happen very, very often, on a daily basis, in this dense environment with many different transport modes. And even though there is much traffic on the center, I do believe that some of these cities are massive. So speeds of vehicles reach high speeds, especially outside of the center. So traffic accidents in many such cities are very, very high. Don't know if Andrea, you have anything to add to that?
Yes, but maybe just a consideration on the city environment. While on the one hand, it may be the case, like we look at for public transport and so on, that lower speed results in lower accidents. At the same time, if there is an accident, the level of income of a person residing and working in the city is higher than the value of income that is normally generated in rural areas. And so if you look at the morbidity, mortality impact, the net present value of the income that is not generated in the future because of an accident, then in that case, there is a more than proportional consequence or value that emerges for the city level because of the higher income of people living in cities. So there's different factors that come together to generate that more aggregate value that Michael presented.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'd like to turn to Magona Berry's question on how will LDCs overcome unsustainable transport challenges in their respective countries. And before turning that broad question to colleagues, I don't know, Magona, if you're sorry to put you on the spot, but if you're in a position to perhaps provide a little bit of context to your question, in terms of the challenges that you've seen specifically. Otherwise, I will turn perhaps to Michael and Andrea to provide thoughts. Maybe one that I'll just help to make the the question a little bit less broad is that in the Mentimeter poll earlier, we saw that there were lots of questions around funding and financing for transport in least developed countries, and I think you've seen throughout the work that these challenges are very real and present, and so perhaps thoughts on that or other challenges related to urban planning and space in cities. I think is another one that we've come across. Magon, I see you're unmuted, so
yes,
go ahead.
Good morning.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, I would like us to just limit it to, for instance, like the introduction of electronic vehicles, because electronic vehicles provide sustainable transportation. So I would just want us to limit the question to that one. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for that context. Andrea, Michael, thoughts around the electronic vehicles?
Yeah, I can start at the general level. Michael, then feel free to dive in and add more detail. I think that we need in a way a policy change first to make so that then the investment can be enabled by both public and private sector, meaning that in the context of developing, rapidly evolving countries and urban context, transport has been seen as a way to enable economic growth, connecting to markets, to public services, bringing people closer to the workplace, and so on and so forth. I think we need to expand a bit the definition to say that transport can be an enabler for sustainable development, which is a low carbon development, a more climate resilient development, one where we reduce air pollution in city centers, and so we reduce the burden on human health, and so on and so forth. This is what provides the rationale for that transition to more sustainable transport. And if you look at vehicles and electric vehicles specifically, the forecasts are indicating from the International Energy Agency, just as an example, that by 2030, we will reach cost parity for some segments, not all of them, of course, not all types of vehicles. But from 2030, there should be cost parity so that if electricity is produced with renewable energy, so with sources that are low carbon sources, then we could have a net reduction in emissions, net reduction in air pollutants, while at the same time providing access to the services and the market that would drive that economic growth. So in a way, if you recognize that there are some negative impacts, side effects of the current approach, and these can decline if you use a more sustainable approach, that also results in additional benefits besides these avoided costs. I think that shift in mentality and in policy, say, formulation will open up for investments in infrastructure, say charging stations and power generation, that will make so that that private investment and the transformation of the transport sector comes up and materializes. Now, this being said, and I close on this point, there will be different trends and different speeds at which countries can sort of transition to electric vehicles, depending on the availability of natural resources for renewable energy generation on the power generation side, or whether there is knowledge and capabilities to expand the network. And at the same time, based on what type of transport modes are currently being used, what type of vehicles are currently being used. We see worldwide a much rapid uptake of two-wheelers that are electric, as opposed to the four-wheelers. Four-wheelers for now are mostly electric in the premium luxury SUV type of segment, not so much on the utility vehicle, the smaller ones that are cheaper also to purchase, and so on and so forth. And so they will have to see a bit of a transition, and some countries will be able to move faster than others depending on these cost differentials. I'll stop here. Michael, over to you.
Thank you for this, and I definitely agree with the argument specifically for electric vehicles that electrifying vehicles is really important, but decarbonizing the electricity supply that is supplying this electricity to the vehicles is equally important, even more maybe. But just to answer your question more widely and not specific to electric vehicles, how will different countries overcome the unsustainable transport challenges? Again, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It depends on the country. It depends on the urban context within the country. It depends on many different factors, such as, for example, density, current transport modes, the informal transport sector in the cities and how we can integrate it with a formal one. So I think the solutions are slightly different in every case, in every country, in every city. For example, in very dense cities, public transport is a better solution than using electric cars. In maybe the countryside or very spread out cities, electric cars should be part of the solution. So yes, overall, I just wanted to mention that the solution is completely different in different regional and urban and national contexts.
Thank you both. I don't know if Magona has any other thoughts or responses to this. Floor is yours. Otherwise, we'll move on with another question. Okay, let me pick up two questions that came in from Sandesh Hamal on the specifics around the non-motorized transport projects. One is, were there any unforeseen impacts from switching to NMT? And if you have any thoughts on the ideal distance for travel by NMT, and do the benefits actually diminish over long distance travel?
So to address the first question of unforeseen impacts, actually we had one when we looked at the health impacts. As I mentioned during the presentation, we looked at avoided cost of air pollution and also benefits from increased physical activity. The third unforeseen impacts that we looked at is that people that are switching from cars to cycling or walking will have a higher exposure to air pollution. So the value was very, very small, and it was negative, of course, because it's a negative value on health. Was very small compared to the other two values that I just mentioned, but it was an unforeseen impact to understand that someone that is cycling at a certain speed will inhale some harmful particles at a higher rate. So this was one of the impacts that we did model, and it had a small value. And to answer the second part of or your second question, I am not sure what the ideal distance of travel by NMT is. I would imagine that it depends on the terrain, but I mean, this is open to discussion. I would say up to 30 to 40 kilometers. I guess maybe after that, the benefits diminish because it's strenuous exercise or is it's very long distances, but within a dense city, it's ideal. I'm not sure if Andrea, you have anything to add here. I don't know. This is up to discussion about the actual ideal distance.
Yeah, I don't know about the length. You're correct.
Yeah.
It depends on the terrain, the topography, the climate as well. If you have a hilly city as opposed to a flat city, it really changes a lot. That being said, I think the last point you made on density, population density, is the critical one, because we would need to analyze normally the non-motorized transport infrastructure in the same way as we analyze a subway system or a tram system. Basically, we put these investments where we have large volumes of people that need to move from place A to place B. So the same can be said for NMT. You would want to introduce it where you have a lot of people that can and want to walk or use their bicycles. And so it really depends on the urban planning, where the residential areas are, where the commercial areas are, if they're fully integrated or if you're really dislocated in different parts of the city. That density, I think, of population is what determines the success in absolute terms of the investment in NMT. The lower is the population density, in a way, the more diluted the benefit would be in absolute terms, in total dollar value.
Thank you. And I don't know if Sandesh, if you have other kind of other remarks or also experiences where you might have seen kind of other impacts around NMT. Any thoughts you have yourself around this ideal distance? Definitely, we would welcome to hear from you either in the chat or just live. Again, in the meantime, just moving on the questions. Another question from John, and thanks a lot for this
I
one.
can't hear you right now, but I'm not sure whether it's just me.
You can still hear me?
I can hear fine, yes.
Okay. So another question that came in is, to what extent do we take into account possible changes in traffic volumes? Very good question. So for example, working from home, being enabled by the technology we have, traffic volumes might drop. So thoughts on that, Michael, and how you've taken that into account in the assessments, and yeah, as well, of course.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I think it's often hard to consider all different possible changes in traffic volumes. I think this becomes more accurate with technology and AI models that look at satellite data, sometimes live, exactly what's happening in a city and what are the traffic volumes. So you know, this the numbers on this are getting better and better. But it's true, for example, for another assessment, we did consider a percentage of people that post-COVID are working from home and not using their motorized vehicles. So it depends on the data that we have. If we have access to local data that do indicate any changes based on traffic. Otherwise, we start from the baseline, which is basically just a shift from one transport mode to the other. If we have more data on traffic in that city, we try to incorporate it as well. But that depends. That depends on the context and on the project. Andrea, I'm not sure if there's anything else to add
Maybe
here.
If I can add, and Andrea, you may want to come in on this one. Is what are kind of within the methodology that you've developed and that we've been deploying on these assessments. What are some of the ways in which we address these uncertainties around traffic volume?
Yeah, so with the models we develop, we simulate different scenarios. So we allow users, whether it's us as a team or our counterparts, to actually suggest the assumptions to use and modify the assumptions directly in our Excel-based models or system models, so that we can capture the wide range of possible outcomes of different scenarios. A baseline as opposed to one that heavily focuses on what we used to call telework, which is smart work, which is changing and evolving over time. Or maybe we can look at different scenarios for people adapting to higher traffic volume. And so that prompts the use of different transport modes, as Michael mentioned. The bottom line is that this is the net impact, the amount of people that would want to travel and move from place A to place B, of forecasted population growth that we consider at the, say, urban level, city level, or national level, and then the extent to which different transport modes are being used, also in relation to the proportion of travel that will not happen because of smart work. So it's a combination, and the models are set up so that we can easily modify one assumption, and this then is reflected on the full-time series of results that are basically generated for each year of the lifetime of the investment. And so then we can look at the year by year as well as the aggregate impact of changing these assumptions. In short, it is sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis combined with an assessment of the sensitivity of model results to changing model inputs.
Many thanks, both. I don't know if there's other questions from the group on either on SAVi or on the NMT case study specifically. But what I would otherwise suggest, and don't worry, we still have some minutes. We have 10 minutes left, so feel free to keep dropping them in the Q&A or in the chat. Oh, here's one popping in just now. What are the types of indicators used to measure social impacts? Michael or Andrea, on the social impact indicators, which are of course extremely relevant for transport projects. Don't know if you want to give some examples of the ones you've been looking at.
So I would say that most of the indicators that we use for social impacts are based on secondary research. For example, we would categorize the health costs or the avoided cost of traffic accidents as a social impact. Avoided cost of air pollution is environmental, but also social. Increased the benefits from increased physical activity is also social. We also have jobs and income. Let's say on the construction side, from building these networks and these transport projects. We looked at the employment creation. We look at the money that will circulate in the economy from the people that will gain from employment benefits from these projects. And again, as I mentioned, the health and accidents as outcomes. Not sure if anyone else has any other social impacts that come to mind.
Maybe one aspect, Michael, that we look at in an indirect way is that retail spending that we may have increasing as a result of sustainable transport, being public transport or NMT. And then this is somehow connected to the social aspect because it may be used to revitalize economic activity in neighborhoods in areas that maybe have been bypassed historically. Because if they're just in between point A and B, nobody really stops at the moment in these areas. But if people walk and cycle and so on, they help revitalize economically, at least, and socially these areas. So we tackle it as an economic indicator, but there is a lot more on the social side that we glance over in a way.
Thank you. Yeah, it does combine both economic and social impacts, as it has quite a large effect, a large reach on a neighborhood or even urban level. Yeah.
And I guess on the flip side, though, like adding a possibly negative impact, looking at the real estate value, when it increases because we introduce a bus rapid transit system and with the stops that make the area, the neighborhood more desirable, we may actually see the potential residents of an area that used to be low cost being pushed further out of the city center, let's say, because of the increase in real estate value. So sometimes we tackle this explicitly when we have more data. Sometimes it's part of the narrative, but we may see there is a social advantage being created, but then there may be side effects that are also being created, meaning reducing the affordability of living in a certain neighborhood if it becomes more desirable. So this is another of the impacts that we look at.
Thank you very much, both. And as we've gone through all the questions, except one, which is, will there be a session to use the SAVi methodology step by step? But I want to use that question as a segue into very briefly going over what we will be doing next week, because we have 2 other webinars of this sort lined up for you. And Michael, if I could ask you to very quickly share your screen, and then I think we'll have an answer to that question as well. In the meantime, I have dropped a link in the chat to a very, very, very short survey. It won't take you more than 3 minutes of your time, but it's extremely helpful for us to get your feedback on how we can improve our work. So please consider just clicking on that link and filling out the very few questions. It won't take much of your time, I promise. But so for next week, the answer to the question, very short, is yes. We'll actually be diving into the next sessions in more detail into the SAVi methodology, always showcasing an example. And next Tuesday, you'll be hearing about a bus rapid transit system in Bandung in Indonesia. And on Thursday, you'll be hearing about mass rapid transit in Bogota, in Colombia. And that's a session that will take place morning time, Latin America, and afternoon time, Europe. And it will be late evening for some participants from Asia next week, but we'll be recording all of these sessions and sharing the links and recordings with you afterwards, should you not be in a time zone that's convenient for you to follow these. But next week, Tuesday, Michael will dive into more detail on what is systems thinking, what is system dynamics, which is the underlying modeling technology really for the SAVi model, and how do these methods help us understand outcomes of transport policies and investments. You've seen a very quick snapshot of what is a causal loop diagram today, but there is a lot more to unpack there. And that's what we'll be diving into next Tuesday. And then we'll do that by means of the example of the bus rapid transit project in Bandung, Indonesia. So for next week, more technical information to follow on the SAVi methodology and the different steps. And also in Thursday's session, you'll hear more about the quantification of the indicators by means of the example in Colombia. So stay tuned. We'll be very, very happy to see you back next Tuesday and next Thursday for more discussions. Should you have more questions in the meantime, be it on the past session or future sessions, don't hesitate to shoot us a message. I think Michael's email should appear on the next slide, if I'm not mistaken. But that's probably the survey first. There you go. Maybe Michael will put your email in the chat as well, so that if participants want to follow up with you, any other questions they may have, they can drop you a line. But I think we're just on time to close this session. I really want to thank all of the participants for being here, for your questions. We're really looking forward to keep this engagement going with you. So hope you can join us next week as well. And of course, I want to thank my colleagues for being here, Michael for presenting, Andrea for being here, answering the questions and providing context to the work, and Ronja and Becca, as always, for your support here as well. Thank you very much. So wishing everyone a great rest of the day, rest of your evening, afternoon, or morning, and looking forward to see you back next week. Thank you very much.